All right, so we talked about spatial hierarchy and uh, all right, so we talked about spatial organization as it pertains as it's described with sort of spatial hierarchy. Now, the second part of this is in organizational rules, and what this generally means is essentially what are the rules of the environment that sort of dictate how spaces are arranged around it. So, one that we've already been looking quite a lot about is sort of this the case of sort of a centralized arrangement. So in this case, we have sort of a central space like a plaza or a courtyard or things like that. And the spaces around it are arranged in such a way that they interact directly with that space. So each of these sort of walls, like this might be some sort of shop with a doorway that leads out here, and sort of we have this sort of I guess each of these rooms sort of is arranged to sort of support the shape of this interior space. And another way that spaces can be arranged is in a radial pattern, so sort of arranged and aiming towards a central point. Another way is very similar, but oriented towards a focal element. So not necessarily in a radial pattern, but in a case like this, well, maybe this is a square with a large church on the corner of it. So as you can see, like you might have something that looks like a bit of a radial pattern kind of around this area, sort of all pointing at this central focal element. But over here, where the element is sort of is pretty linear, we have a more rectilinear sort of approach where these spaces are oriented towards this in more of a straight up pattern or straight up rectilinear pattern. It can be oriented around an axis of symmetry. This is pretty strong sort of compositional rule that's often used in more impressive spiritual places, kind of like temples and churches, places that sort of need to come across as being impressive. Let's see, another way that we can have sort of an organizational rule is by an environmental condition. So this is, I guess, a lot more relevant, I guess, in sort of architectural design. But if you were to build a sort of structure along the side of a mountain, you're sort of it's necessary to sort of build your the arrangement of your spaces so it sort of interacts directly with the shape of the mountain. And if you're doing level design as opposed to architecture, we have the luxury of actually creating the mountain in order to create the sort of shape. But sort of the concept, at least, is the same, where you could have spaces that sort of are pointed out or pointed in from the sort of environmental condition, or this could be a river also, or it could be the edge of a wood, that sort of thing. Spaces can be oriented to a path or to several paths. In this sort of top-down sort of city structure right here, we have a number of sort of pathways through this area. And as we sort of move through here, we can see how each of these spaces are sort of directed towards the path as they as the sort of the closest point along the path to them. Here's another example of something maybe like a hotel, but of course a lot less interesting because it doesn't sort of like wind and have sort of a dynamic composition. We could have a rotational pattern. You could say a sort of grid pattern. So as you can see here, all of the spaces are oriented in sort of a north to south versus west to east pattern. So there's a number of other sort of compositional sort of rules here that could sort of exist, and really this is just kind of a sampling of what was possible. When we talked about composition, we in last lecture we talked about how groupings can sort of create sort of compositional structure here, sort of like essentially if you have different objects that are sort of different colors, the green ones feel like they sort of are related to one another. In this rotation right here, the ones that are sort of off at a 45-degree angle feel like they are sort of part of a singular whole. Proximity is a very strong indicator for feeling like this is these sort of our space of identity. And